Elk. Elk. Everywhere. So how did Estes Park and Rocky Mountain National Park become so overrun with elk? Has it always been that way? Today we're exploring the elk and human interaction in the Estes Valley. We'll talk with a local historian, 2 park rangers, and a wildlife biologist to try to help answer that nagging question. What's up with all the elk? We are here today at the Estes Park Museum with Dr. James Pickering. He wrote some of the very informational books on Estes Park history. Welcome, Dr. Pickering.
Thank you, Emily.
Dr. Pickering, tell us how the elk first disappeared from the Estes Valley.
Admiral Sprague, one of our earliest pioneers, tells us that in the 1870s, the elk came down from the mountains by the hundreds in the fall. But by 1900, they were all gone because the early settlers hunted them for food. But more importantly, every fall, the hunters from the valley would come up, hunt the elk, and take them down to Denver and the other Front Range towns and sell them for their meat.
When were the elk reintroduced to the valley?
In 1913 and again in 1915, Mr. Stanley and Mr. Hondius and the other residents of Estes Park pooled their money and they bought 2 small herds of elk from Wyoming in the Yellowstone region, brought them down by train to Lyons, and then put them on the backs of Stanley steamer cars in cages, brought them to Estes Park and released them into what would then become, 1915, the National Park.
Tell us how the elk came to be overpopulated.
Those 2 small elk herds began to multiply very rapidly, and they did that through the 1920s. And part of the reason that they multiplied so quickly was the National Park Service and our own park here had a policy of getting rid of the predators, particularly the mountain lions. And so there was nothing to stop those elk from multiplying, and they did. And so by 1931, less than 20 years after they were introduced, they began to leave the park in numbers, and that's when we began to notice that they were down here in the village and not just in the national park. We knew that there was a problem because farmers began to report that the elk were in their fields, in their haystacks, and of course that hay was what they were raising to so they could live on here. And of course the elk remain one of our greatest assets. And we know a lot more about them now than we did certainly back in 1913 and 1915 when Mr. Stanley and Mr. Hondius brought them back to Estes Park.
From what I learned about the elk, I'm afraid Estes Park will be overrun with animals of that kind, and we may have to get Roosevelt up there to help reduce the number.
Today we are here with Ranger Holly and Ranger Nicole. They are going to answer some questions about the elk in the Rocky Mountain National Park. Welcome. How do the elk affect the wildlife in the Rocky Mountain National Park?
The 2 plant species that are going to be directly affected by them are the aspen and the willow.
Both of those plants are huge habitat resources for the animals that we have in the park, specifically the beaver population that we have. The more browsing that elk will do on the aspen and willow will decrease the habitat for them to live, their marshland habitat in the riparian area in the park.
What are exclosures and what do you use them for?
It's basically an area that's fenced off, keeping the elk out. There's 2 different types of exclosures that we have in Rocky Mountain National Park. The first one, they go back to the 1980s. Those were research exclosures to do research on aspen and willow as well as elk, trying to get some of that preliminary data that was coming out.
We also have what are called management exclosures in the park, and those are easily identifiable. Most of those were created in 2008 and beyond. Everything can fit under that fence, it's at a specific height, except for the elk, of course. And also, it's important to remember with these, we are adapting them for visitor use as well.
So really what we're trying to do is just give that willow and aspen a good head start on their growth, and then it can be moved to another area and help out other plants that really need it.
We are here with Dr. Rick Spowert, who is an expert from the Colorado Division of Wildlife.
Thank you, Emily.
Dr. Spowert, are the elk in the Estes Valley overpopulated?
Currently, in this game management unit, GMU 20, the elk are not overpopulated. We might have a distribution problem, which would mean at certain times of the year we probably have too many elk, or as I like to put it, too much of a good thing in Estes Park.
Can you tell us what CWD is?
CWD are the initials for chronic wasting disease. It's a neurologic disease that's always fatal, and CWD is in the deer herds, elk, mule deer, white-tailed deer, and moose in Colorado.
How does the DOW monitor the elk herds and numbers?
We do several things. Every year we have elk classifications and counts. We count not only total number of elk we see, but we have marked animals, and by using what's called a Lincoln-Peterson index, we can get a really good idea of the total number of animals, since we can't always count the total number. We also classify elk, which means we look at cows, calves, or young of the year, and bulls and cows. So we have a cow-calf ratio and a bull-cow ratio, and we plug all this information into a computer model that spits out what our elk population is doing. We also plug in to that model elk harvest data. We have 10 elk hunting seasons in Game Management Unit 20, and that's how we monitor and manage populations statewide. Biggest, baddest predator that is missing in the park is humans. Prehistoric man hunted in Rocky Mountain National Park, the Utes and Arapaho hunted in the park, and European man, when they settled in Estes Park, unfortunately, with the advent of gunpowder, extirpated or killed all the elk in the park, and that's why they had to be reintroduced from Yellowstone. As far as the missing predators, not only wolves and grizzly bears are missing, but human predation is missing in Rocky Mountain National Park.